Hello, I'm Connie Evans, and I am going to be talking about my latest book, Valor Under Fire. But I'd like to thank the Ware Public Library for hosting this author talk. I'm going to begin by talking about how I got started fictionalizing Ware history. I'll talk a little bit about my research, and then I'll get into an outline on the book. So I wrote 2 other books, and I got my information out of the wonderful History of Ware, good old William Little, who wrote this with his team in 1888. And I really wanted to learn a little bit more about the Pine Tree Riot. I had heard about it, as most people have, but I didn't know the details. So of course I went to the source. And if you are interested in the history of Ware, I think it's 1735 to 1888, you can access it online. And it's full, chock full, believe me, of crazy anecdotes and fun stories and interesting information. But so after I read what happened at the Pine Tree Riot, I was also retired at the time, just recently retired. And I thought it would be kind of fun to write a story. I mean, we know the details, but what about the human part of it? And, I'm going to have to tell you, I was not a writer, but I just was really interested in doing this. So Ebenezer Mudgett and the Pine Tree Riot. I kind of wish now that I just left it as the Pine Tree Riot. Kind of sounds like a children's book, but so I thought, the only research I'd have to do would be the history of Ware, but oh no, what did they wear? What did they eat? There's just tons of information that needed to be researched. Although history of Ware helped out quite a bit. I learned a lot, believe me. After that, I thought, well, let's go back to the history of Ware, see what else there is. And I was fascinated with the fact that Ware had witches. Who knew? I thought they were only in Salem. And so I thought, how in the world does somebody get labeled a witch? So I thought, well, there's a story to be told there. So I wanted to write about that. And that wasn't very long. So I thought I would do another short story. And I was intrigued by Timothy Corliss, who had been abducted by Indians. He was hunting and fishing in the wilds of Ware, which wasn't Ware then, but and Indians caught him and they marched him all the way to Canada, 300 miles, bad weather, outside, not good. And my research there, I had read a lot of books. I was fascinated by this on survivors who had been abducted. There was a community in Deerfield, Mass, and they had been attacked, and many people had been taken for ransom. And Hannah Dustin and a few others. And they all seem to have the same stories, the same treatment. So I figured poor old Timothy went through the same. So that became Tales of Survival in Colonial New England. And this is what we're going to be talking about, Valor Under Fire. And I have to say, I did not expect to be so incredibly proud of our men. I learned something that I bet few, if any, people in Ware know about their involvement in the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is a misnomer. It really was fought on Breed's Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. But I hope you read my book, of course, but even just to learn about how wonderful these men performed under adverse conditions. And I guess that seems to be what I'm attracted to. All 3 books, the tenacity, the just keep on keeping on of these men in spite of any difficulty in adverse situations. Believe me, we have it, and I'm sure you know, very cushy. Certainly going through a tough time now with the pandemic and quarantining and all that. But boy, life was tough. Not for the faint of heart. So, problems. I got a list of, first of all, I thought, oh, well, after these two books, I'm going to write about the American Revolution. Oh, yeah, bite off more than I could chew. And then I realized, well, we have to limit this because there's just too much information. So I decided to do Minutemen and through Bunker Hill. And actually, the siege of Boston includes the Concord and Lexington up to the evacuation of the British, just under a year. So I thought, well, I could probably do that. And so I checked my source, my go-to source right away, and I found there were 13 men that were Minutemen, 2 of which went on to fight at Bunker Hill. Altogether at Bunker Hill, according to William Little, there were 8 men. And I cross-referenced that with the New Hampshire State Papers, and they had a different list. It was as well as the National Park at Bunker Hill. So I thought, that's weird, because some people were in our history that weren't in those other 2 sources, and some people were in the sources, those 2 sources that weren't in the history. So I had to figure out who my characters were going to be, and it was important to me to get it right. I wanted to have the men that were in those key locations at Bunker Hill so we could see it from their perspective. I mean, I could have made up some people, but I really wanted the names. I wish I knew more about them other than their names. I mean, I had to fictionalize quite a bit there. You know, their personalities, their physical conditions and attributes. But so I finally settled on 10 men. And the 2 that had left the Minutemen, you know, after that, I'll get into that. After that was over, they joined up with 8 and they went down to John Stark. Now, this is where I think the records got confusing. John Stark, wonderful, wonderful leader, loved by the men, very well respected, but not a good record keeper. And his records got lost. He was also miffed because he didn't get a promotion that he felt he deserved when Washington came aboard. And so he was miffed, and maybe in retaliation, I don't know, why would he do that? But whatever, he did not submit, you know, the proper lists. So as a result, nobody really knew. Did he have 10 companies, 12 companies, 13 companies? Nobody knew exactly. Okay, so I had that problem. And then, you know, in coming up with these names, I found one man, Ebenezer Sinclair. He had several spellings, and I wanted to make sure I got it right, because in those days, everything was phonetic, you know, they didn't, most of it. So spelling was a problem, just to make sure I had the right guy. Sometimes it was Sinclair, you know, so. And also Moses Follansbee, he was another one. His name had a multitude of spellings. And then duplicate names. There are 2 men that are in my 10, both with the name Moses. That was a very common name. So one of them I had to change to Moy. So that was no biggie, but I was a little upset that I had to change the name of a real person. So my historical research, not only did I lean on the history of Ware, but there's this fantastic blog. It's called Boston 1775. A man named J.L. Bell, he does a daily one, and he's done over 5,000 blogs, and he picks away at details like you wouldn't believe. Things that you would never, ever, you know, imagine. He also debunks theories. things, sometimes families uh, go on and tell stories, and generation after generation, they get exaggerated, and pretty soon they go into history books. And, sometimes they're not right. And he debunks them. So that's kind of neat. So I loved getting information. As a matter of fact, we communicated on a topic. I asked him, how in the world did all these men get fed? Here, thousands are pouring into the Cambridge area, thousands. And we weren't an organized army. It was just a citizen army, militia, just, coming from all these different towns. So he helped answer that for me. I was very grateful, but also other details, that came in very handy. And obviously I used a multitude of other sources. As a matter of fact, I wanted people to know what was fact and what was fiction. So I have an extensive notes section in the book, and I put in a bibliography. And I don't think people normally in a novel will add those things, but I felt it was important. So also, a friend of mine had asked where I got all the terms that I use. They're pretty odd. And if you do get my book, I hope you look in the glossary section because there are some interesting words there. I actually found a book that was printed in 1796, a classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue, it's called, and wonderful, wonderful expressions. Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. Also, I got a lot of, obviously, incidents that I used during this 10, 11-month period that I attributed to our men in some cases, not all, but some. And a case in point is when we had some of our men join the Massachusetts Regiment, and I'll get into that later. But so when they were building they built a redoubt, and the walls were very, very tall. So they had a platform and maybe 6 feet high. And during the course of the battle, there were some men that were just shell-shocked and they couldn't function. And so this one man who I gave it to, this incident, I gave it to a man named Jonathan. He noticed that, and he had no problem, and he was a good shooter. So and it took 30, well, maybe more, but 30 seconds to reload a musket. I can't even imagine doing that with the enemy charging at you and you're trying to reload the musket. But so he yelled at them and said, "Pass me a musket. I'll fire. I'll hand it back to somebody who'll reload." And so there was this constant, he constantly was firing, boom, 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 boom. And the men finally came out of their state. But so and then that's in the notes sections, what is real, what isn't. So, I mean, it was real, but one of our men didn't do it. Okay, so the general outline, I start with the Minutemen, as I said, and it was kind of anticlimactic when they got to Cambridge. Everything, they didn't have technology to tell them everything's over, so don't bother coming. So they got there, and as I said, it was not an organized army, so it was totally chaotic. The men were just milling around, wondering what to do. Some men weren't following if they had an officer, their officer's instructions. They certainly were not going to listen to anybody they didn't know. That's that's mentioned through Washington's perspective as well. These men did not want to pay attention to anybody else, no matter what the rank was, if they didn't know them or if they weren't from their colony. So when they got to, they did an interesting thing called riding and tying. As they go to Cambridge, a man they'd be paired up. A man would ride a horse, and his partner would take off on foot. After a certain amount of time, the rider would tie up his horse. The runner would get to the horse, And the rider would have already left on foot. So it was a leapfrogging to get to Cambridge. So this was in April and mid-April, so you can imagine it wasn't easy to leave the farm, and there was tons of stuff to do. So they hung around for a while. They realized their provisions were running out. There was nothing going on, so they went back home. And Ephraim Hadley and Sam Caldwell, two young men, you know, they were terribly disappointed, and they wanted some action. So they went on to Bunker Hill, and they answered John Stark's call to start a regiment. Now, really interesting, New Hampshire had the biggest regiment of any of the colonies. And maybe that's why John Stark was able to loan, under John Stark. And that's probably why he was able to loan Massachusetts to maybe more companies. So there's that. And let me see where I'm kind of lost myself. Oh, okay. So they go to train, and nothing really happens until the Battle of Chelsea Creek, which is something I had never heard of before. Very interesting. When the British arrived, the people, a lot of people stayed in Boston, a lot of the colonists, but some realized that, you know, they weren't loyalists and they better get out. And a lot of the farmers would leave their livestock, excuse me, on islands. They didn't have to worry about fences, and whenever they needed to butcher an animal, they'd go to the island. So there was always, there are many islands around Boston. Two in particular, Hog Island and Noddle's Island, had a lot of livestock. As the British were pouring into the Boston Peninsula, they needed to be fed, and they just had salted meat, and you know, they were running out of good stuff, and they had commandeered a lot from the Bostonians. But they decided, wow, you know, we've got the livestock on these two islands. Why don't we go get it? Our men were not going to hear about that. They needed it. They were going hungry. So there was a race to get the livestock before the British could. And that's the Battle of Chelsea Creek. And it was the first confrontation our men had with the British. They did participate in this. And it showed the British, oh, these Americans, boy, you know, they're not going to sit idle and let us get away with anything. It was an eye-opener for them. So once again, boredom set in. They did some training, but it wasn't until Dr. Warren heard about, there was a massive spy ring. It was interesting. They had heard that the British were going to attack. They were hemmed in on the peninsula of Boston. Outside, there's an arc, an 8-mile arc, where our men from various colonies, from Medford to Roxbury, were camping. And so nobody was making a move first until Dr. Warren heard about the British. They were going to attack on the 18th of June. On the night of the 16th of June, Colonel Prescott, and he's from Massachusetts, and General Putnam from Connecticut, decided that they would better go over onto the Charlestown Peninsula, which was across from Boston Peninsula, and get some fortifications, entrenchments, and, you know, be a formidable presence so that they could stop them, because they did not want them to cross into Cambridge, and then that would be a disaster. So on that night, and this is where John Stark loaned a couple companies, so some of our men went with them. And I should also point out, I know where our men were because I looked up who their captains were, and it's publicized where the captains were stationed. So I know these 10 men spread out during the Battle of Bunker Hill were in the key points. So the night of the 16th, they worked all night. Their food ran out, their water ran out, their rum ran out. They were exhausted. They hadn't slept. They were obviously dehydrated because it was a very, very hot time. And they were waiting to be reinforced. They were told they would be. And they were also going to get refreshments. Nothing came. And I should also say, Colonel Prescott was supposed to go to Breed's Hill, or Bunker Hill, rather. That's the tallest hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. And it was safer because it was not as close to the warships in the water or Boston. And for whatever reason, he passed by Bunker Hill and went to Breed's Hill. Much closer, more dangerous. Nobody knows if this was a calculated decision or whether he got lost in the night or whatever. But so they were fortifying Breed's Hill. And as I said, the men in mostly Massachusetts and Connecticut were not going to be listening to anybody they didn't know. And Prescott was trying to get them to reinforce the men that had worked all night, and they wouldn't go. They refused. They just sat there. 1,000 men sat there looking down, watching, and they did that during the battle too. It was like entertainment to them. So a lot of Massachusetts men deserted. They ran away. Our men did not one man. And yet it was a very common thing where the men deserted. Another thing I should say that it just makes me so proud, and this is what I had alluded to in the beginning. When John Stark arrived the following afternoon, he looked at the situation from the vantage point of Bunker Hill. He looked down and he realized, whoa, our left flank is extremely weak. That is exactly where the British are going to attack. So he said, I'm going to fortify that. And Prescott said, fine, I trust you. He asked for his best men in this one company to be at this rock wall. And the rock wall was right off the Mystic River, and then the rail fence. He wanted his sharpshooters, which is funny because muskets aren't that accurate. And our men were the sharpshooters. Our men were the best he had. And they performed beautifully. Sure enough, the British attacked at that area. They decimated it, the men. If we had not run out of powder, the war may have stopped right there. Unfortunately, men ran out of ammunition, and but until then, the Welsh Fusiliers who were attacking along the beach where our men were behind a rock wall, they lost so many officers because the command was aim, if you could aim, try to aim. Muskets aren't that great. At the brightest uniforms. Those are the officers. So that was the command, to try to get the officers. They put a huge dent in this military machine. Even though we lost the battle rather, we frightened them to the point where they could have attacked again. They could have done a lot more damage after. They actually were afraid, which is really interesting. And yeah, they got whooped. Even though they actually won, more men were lost on the British side, and more valuable men. So I had said that John Stark had the largest regiment. I want to give you a little fact about Ware. Ware had and I don't know the population, but 206 men that participated in the war from, one point or another during that span of time. And they had 41 Quakers. So I would imagine that 200, and Quakers weren't going to fight, but 206 served. That had to be every able man. It was the largest number per capita of any other town in New Hampshire. And I got that from William Little. So there you have it. And as I said, it goes on to the evacuation. There's a long span of time from June 17th, when the Battle of Bunker Hill, Breedsville, took place, and March. And right after Bunker Hill, Washington came aboard. And man, I learned a lot about Washington. He was not happy with us. He was not happy. So that was really interesting. And so March 17th, the evacuation, not only St. Patty's Day, but yay, the British left Boston. So if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. My email is cke1@comcast.net. And thank you so much if you've been, patient and lasted this long. Thank you so much for listening.